All right, Tim. So I was showing you just some introductions into these opening ideas and the idea of controlling central squares, d4, e4, d5, and e5. But the thing is opening theory and the opening in chess is way more than just trying to control central squares. Otherwise, it would just be as simple as something like this, right? Like this is not the way a chess game opens, right? However, there are some openings that do open similarly to that, and we'll start with this idea of the center game. That's e4, e5, d4. Now this, the center game, right? The actual proper response is not to reinforce, because if you reinforce it, then after the trade, then, oops, excuse me, that's not, I meant to play queen takes queen there. But after queen takes queen and then black loses its ability to castle, white is slightly better. Now the computer may not say white is that much better, but white is slightly better with black having lost its ability to castle. But what usually happens instead is black actually takes, and he takes this pawn, and if white takes back with the queen, then black can have this free developmental move, knight c6, which can then threaten the queen on d4. So the main thing, right, to think about is that what openings always do is they tend to exchange these different kind of principles for different things. So in this opening, the actual best move here is not to take with queen, in my opinion. It's actually to play pawn to c3. And the reason why you play pawn to c3 is you're hoping that black is just going to take it. And after he takes it, you're giving up a pawn, but you're then getting a little bit more development in exchange. You're actually trading time for development. So black, right, which might then play d6 in order to pressure the e5 square, right, you'll see that white very quickly has this advantage of more pieces developed, right? It now has, in this position with black to move, it has 3 pieces developed to black's 1. So the whole point of sometimes giving up material is to gain time, right? So frequently people will sacrifice in the opening, will sacrifice a little bit of material in order to get more time. But the way in which you fight for the center, it changes in different ways. One of the more inventive and interesting defenses to e4 is what's called Alekhine's defense. And Alekhine's defense is knight f6, which then immediately attacks this e4 pawn. Now, you could just defend it, and that's actually not as good, because then black should just play e5, and you're in a Vienna game, which is not particularly strong. But the actual move that white should play here is to immediately actually just push, to go right to e5, and it forces black to move immediately. Forces black to move. And what white can then do is play c4, which of course attacks d5, forcing the knight to move again. The knight is now attacking c4, but it doesn't matter because the bishop is defending c4. And then what can happen is now white can get even more space and play pawn to d4. Now, this opening might seem way, way better for white. In fact, a lot of people thought that black might be losing here, because look at all the space that, look at all the extra space, look at all of the center pressure that black appears to have, or that white appears to have, rather. It looks really, really bad, right? But the thing is the thing that you should understand is that when this pawn, right, this e5 pawn, when it went from e4 to e5, it actually weakened it, because now it's pressuring these squares and not these squares. So because of that, this position is actually rather weak. The way the opening usually continues is d6 and then either knight f3 or sometimes f4, which is called the 4-pawn attack. Alekhine's defense, the 4-pawn attack. And the interesting thing is even though white has this really intimidating looking pawn formation, anytime you put anything in the center, it is both an object of attack, right? It's trying to gain space, but it's also a target. anything you put out there can also be targeted. And the key to Alekhine's defense is to actually draw out, these pawns in order to then destroy them in the center. You can try to control the center from different ways. Like as we saw, you don't necessarily have to try to control the center this classical way by occupying it with pawns, right? That's one way, but there's also other ways of doing it. And to show how that can work, I'm going to show you another mainline theory, and it's called the King's Indian defense. And I'm not going to get into it too deeply, but it's just important to show you how chess can work. So King's Indian is a d4 opening. We haven't talked about that nearly as much. There are two major classical responses. There's the d5 response. The d5 response usually invites the queen's gambit, which really isn't even a gambit, but we'll talk about that some other time. But the other major response to d4 is simply knight f6. Knight f6, as you can see, it targets the d5 and the e4 squares, so it's pressuring the center right away. And it keeps black from being able to play e4 right away because you'll just take it. So, having said that, right, what is the next move after knight f6 usually? It's usually either knight f3, which keeps the opening very, very flexible. You can do a lot of different things from this position. Or it's c4, right? Adding pressure to d5 and then kind of creating this pawn center near the center of the board, right? And just trying to build pressure that way. Now, there are a lot of different Indian defenses, but the defense we're going to look at here is the King's Indian, which begins with g6. And here what often white does is plays knight c3. Plays knight c3 in order to prepare e4 because the c3 knight defends e4. Then black will either fianchetto his bishop here, or he might play d6 in order to pressure this e5 square and this c5 square. But what he also can simply do, he can also play d5 and strike at the center immediately. This is called the Grunfeld. But what he also can do is just simply play bishop to g7, which invites e4, and then castles, and then we're off to the races. Here, white is going to either play this move. This move is the King's Indian defense, what's called the normal variation, right? Or he's going to play the knight out, and this is also the normal variation. But these have very different structures. Now, this structure is a little bit more common, so we'll look at this for just a second. Plays d5, right? Bishop e2, right? And the move that usually comes next is either going to be c5 or e5. We'll look at e5 because it's a little bit more common. And the move that usually follows here is often this d5 move. Okay? Now, when you look at this position, you see that it appears that white has this really formidable presence in the center. And it seems that black is really, really kind of cramped in compared to white. But the thing is, the whole point of this e5 move is it's actually trying to provoke this d5 advance. Like, that's the whole point. And the whole point of provoking it is, the whole point of the King's Indian is it's hoping that over time, white is going to overextend itself. Because the idea is basically going to be, over a matter of time, that, you know, the goal is that white, which is going to be trying to attack over here, probably on the queen side, because that's where his pawns are going. If you can see, like, the direction of where white's attack is going, it's going this way, right? But black is going to hope that white, after overextending itself, black is going to have the opportunity to attack on the king side. He's actually hoping to bring his pieces this way. So the thing is, even though the game is a fight for the center, if you push too far, right? Because the moment that this pawn went to d5, it actually began to cede the center a little bit. Because when this pawn went here, it actually gave up its pressure on the c5 and the e5 squares. So you can push forward, but by pushing forward, if you can be drawn forward, you can actually lose domination in the center. Okay? So, I mean, I know that's probably a little bit overcomplicated for now, but we're just going to stop here because I've been looking at that. These are just a couple of little different lines, different ideas that you can consider for the time being. And I'm going to show you some more typical ideas in which white and black fight for the center.